Okay, so I'm just going to go ahead and start up Visual Studio 2017, and we're going to click File, New Project to create a new project. And now we're just going to select ASP .NET Core Web Application, and be sure to check the one that is .NET Core and not the standard .NET Framework Web Application. And so we're just going to give this a name, and in my case I'm going to call it Lambda Forums, but you're welcome to call it whatever you'd like. And also be sure to choose a location that you like to store your projects here as well. So we're going to create a directory for the solution, and we'll also select create a new Git repository. So I'll say OK. And now we'll be asked if we'd like to use a template for our project. And so you can see with .NET Core 2.0 that we have a few more options here than we're used to seeing if you're coming from a .NET Core 1.0 or previous. But in our case, we are simply going to use this web application template with model view controller, and we're going to change authentication to individual user accounts. And so we'll select OK here. And this is actually going to bring in the .NET Core identity membership system. It's going to allow us to do user authentication and authorization out of the box, more or less, and provide us with some of that capability, which we can take a look at here in just a little while. So we'll say OK here. And so it'll take a moment here just to go ahead and scaffold our project out for us. And now you can see over on the right side of the screen here, inside of our Solution Explorer, we have our entire project. And so after just a few seconds, it's going to restore all the NuGet packages that it comes pre-installed with. And then you'll notice we also have folders for our controllers and our models and views as well. So that makes up sort of part of our MVC framework here. Also notice that we have a folder for our data with a migrations folder already in it, as well as this application DB context C# file. And we'll take a look at that in just a moment here. We have a folder for services, which has an email sender and an email sender interface. And then, in the views, you can see we have some standard views that came with our template, including some home views and then some account views. In fact, quite a number of account views here for authentication and authorization, that sort of thing. So we have like login and register, as well as some default templates for things like access denied, responses, and that sort of thing. So, all right, let's go ahead and we'll minimize that. And I'm going to close each of these files as well. And then we have some template files here. So if we go inside the shared directory, you can see that we have a layout file as well as a login partial. We've got some validation script partial and an error page. So this layout page that you see here in our shared directory, in our views directory, is basically the page that all of the other views in our system will be rendered inside. So if we scroll down to the middle of that template here, you can see we're using Razor syntax here with the @ symbol, which you may hear me call spiral sometimes. So we've got spiral render body method here. So this is Razor, and basically what it's going to do is it's going to inject the various other CSHTML files we have here that represent our views. And so our layout consists of sort of the base markup that we have. So it's got our HTML tag, a head tag, which contains our title and that sort of thing. Notice also that this is how our title will get dynamically generated here. Notice also that this is where we will be putting things like our CSS for the site. And if we scroll down, we also have this Razor syntax for @render section scripts with required equal to false. And so we'll take a look at how we can put various sort of bundles, if you will, of scripts on each of our pages, or even in the template if we'd like. So you can see that we have some scripts here, for instance, including jQuery and Bootstrap. So if we take a look actually in the www root directory in our project structure over here, this is where all of the static files for our application live. So you can see we have directories for CSS, for images, for JavaScript, and then for third-party libraries here, where you can see Bootstrap and jQuery. And you can see that these sort of local copies of that are actually listed as fallback sources for this remote CDN version of jQuery and for Bootstrap that we're bringing in. Okay, we won't worry about that too much, but it is useful to note that this www root directory is where we will be serving up all of the different static files that we may create for our application. So eventually things like background images or some of that sort of default static content that we may generate. We'll just go ahead and minimize that for now. And then the other thing to note inside of the root of our project here is that we have a series of different JSON files and then a program and startup C# files. So let's go ahead and look at the app settings.json file. You can see that since we actually implemented identity, it's actually already scaffolded out a default connection string for us here, and it will be connecting to an instance of local DB and then a database name here that it's just auto-generated. And we can go ahead and change that here in just a moment. But it's worth noting that the configuration for our project will be done in a series of different JSON files. So for instance, we have our app settings.json. If we expand that, you'll notice also that we have this app settings.development.json. And so this, as you'll see, when we configure our application, we can control sort of what gets overwritten by specifying the environment name here in our JSON file. So for instance, if we have specific app settings for a test environment or a production environment or a staging environment, that sort of thing, we can have those configured here underneath our app settings.json file. All right, then we have a bower.json file and a bundleconfig.json file as well. So we won't worry about too much about these, but you can kind of see their structure and what they're doing here. In this case, bundling and minifying some of our various assets. Okay, so now let's take a look at something a little bit more interesting, which is actually our program.cs file. Okay, and so in this file, you can see this is going to look a little bit different as well, even from .NET Core 1.0, but we've basically got the main entry point for our application, which is just the static void main method, of course. And we've got this static iWebhost build webhost method that gets run. And you can see that we're calling this create default builder method, which is actually going to handle our configuration. So we won't actually have to make any changes to our program.cs file here, and you can see it's actually quite small. And so this build web host with our create default builder is actually handling quite a lot for us. If you're coming perhaps from a .NET Core 1.0 background, then you may be used to seeing a series of sort of chained methods on a web host builder method with extension methods like use Kestrel and use content root and some various different types of configuration. Now we have just something kind of compact that's handling all of that for us inside of our create default builder method. Okay, in any case, we won't need to worry about too much more in our program.cs file. Just to know that this is sort of where the main method gets called and we have this build web host. So now let's go take a look in our startup.cs file. So here we can see that we have a constructor for our startup class in which we have actually injected our configuration. And so we can take a look at the two methods here that we have in our startup class, one being configure services and the other being configure. So this looks pretty similar to previous versions of .NET Core. One being configure services here and the other being configure. And so configure services will actually be used to do things like add the DB context, which you can see has already been scaffolded out for us here. We are adding the identity service, which again is the sort of out-of-the-box membership system for ASP.NET. And we also have the ability to add, say, like singletons or scoped services to our application. And we'll look at that in more detail when we actually create a service layer that handles some of the interaction with our database. But this is basically going to allow us to do some dependency injection in our controllers. So we'll actually define interfaces that our controllers will then request services for, and then we'll have services that implement those specific interfaces. And that way all of our sort of DB context and interaction with the database is actually not handled inside of our controller and will all be handled in the service layer. So we sort of create a nice separation of concerns there using dependency injection. And we'll take a closer look at that when we actually start building out our first services. And then you can see we're also registering the MVC service here as well. So this email sender service is actually something that came, I believe, when we set up identity with this template. And likewise, this default connection string was brought in as well with this application DB context. So that'll be something else we take a look at very shortly. So now if we just look down into the configure method, this is where our sort of middleware gets set up. So this is where our HTTP request pipeline is configured. And we can see that we actually pass it the hosting environment. So we can say things like, if this is a development environment, do certain things, have a certain type of configuration, for instance, use maybe a more verbose exception page and error pages and that sort of thing. Otherwise, we may write some specific exception handler that we use for our typical end users, where we don't want to share too much information about how our software might fail, perhaps. And then you can see here is where we also call use static files, use authentication, and use MVC. And then we define how our routing is set up. So you can see that our routing is going to be set up with the controller and then the action followed by some optional ID. So you can see that the default values for those here will be home and index. And yeah, ID will be optional. And so we'll also take a look at this as we build out some of our first controllers. But you can kind of see how this is working. So for instance, in our controllers folder, we have a home controller here, and then we should be able to find an index action in that home controller, and that will be sort of what gets called as the default values are set for each of these parts of our route. So let's go ahead and take a look at our home controller, and we can see that index action here, and it's simply returning an empty view, or a view without any model getting passed to it. And if all of this sort of MVC stuff is completely new to you, then that was so far kind of a lot all at once. But I can assure you that as we work through writing all of the custom code that we're going to be putting into this application and all the controllers and models and views that we'll be implementing, you will definitely start to get a feel for how this all works very shortly. Let's go ahead and just fire up the application and see what we have scaffolded out for us. And to do that, you can hit F5 as long as this is set to be the active project, or you can also select the play button up here with IIS Express. And so that's just going to fire up an instance of Chrome or your default browser. Okay, and now you can see that this is sort of the default application that we have. So we have some bootstrap styling going on here with a sort of carousel at the top of the page, some various columns with some links in them. We have the title of our application here, and we have like a home link here, an about link, and a contact, and then the option to register or log in as well with some default templates here. Okay, so speaking of our routing, if you take a look here at the route, say on our login page, we have the base URL for application, in this case running on localhost port 44.322, and then we have /account/login. So the first part of our URL here, as is defined as we saw in our startup.cs class, this is our controller. And so we should have a file called accountcontroller.cs in our controllers folder in our web project. So in our controllers folder here, we can see that we do indeed have this accountcontroller.cs file. Then if we head back and we take a look at the last part of this particular URL where we have this login. And so we should see a login action in our account controller. So if I just scroll down here, you can see it right here. Okay, and we won't worry too much about what this login action is doing. You can see that we have a few different overloads for login. We've got this login here, which takes just a return URL string with a default value of null, and then we have another one here, which looks like it's taking a view model as well as a return URL string. We won't worry about too much about what's going on inside here, but just to get familiar with the sort of structure of our routing here in this application. Likewise, if I click on home here, note that the default value for our route, again back in our startup class here, was the home controller index action, and so that's not actually getting rendered here in our address bar, but in fact if we look in our home controller, the index action, this is actually what's getting called. And in fact, if I set a breakpoint here, so if you just click toward the edge of your editor in Visual Studio, you should be able to set a breakpoint here. And so if I come back to the page and reload it, notice that our breakpoint gets hit. And so this is how we're actually going to debug code, not just in our controllers, but elsewhere as well. And then if you hit F5, that's actually going to just release from the breakpoint and continue executing code until it hits another breakpoint. In our case, which we have no other breakpoints. So our page just refreshes. So we'll be making use of that system to sort of debug our code as well. Okay, so now you may be wondering sort of where is all this HTML coming from and how is it getting rendered? So that's going to take place in our views. So if we take a look in our views directory here, so far we've looked at the controller. Let's go ahead and take a look at our views. So if we expand the home folder and look in our index.cshtml file, this is where all of the markup for our index page is actually being written. And so this is all going to get generated dynamically because these are CSHTML files, and so we can actually use the Razor View engine to write some C# to sort of dynamically modify these view pages. So for instance, you can see this spiral and then curly braces. We have this view data dictionary where we can specify a title, and then we could use this view data dictionary elsewhere, referencing it on this page using Razor syntax. But besides that, it's sort of just standard HTML. And if you're familiar with Bootstrap, then you'll be seeing lots of Bootstrap styling here in this template. So yeah, we're actually going to remove all of this because we'll be writing all of our views from scratch. But this was just to get you the idea of where the actual HTML is coming from. That will all be coming from within our views folder here. And we should have a folder for each controller, or corresponding to each of our controller classes here. So we have one controller for home, and we may have a number of different views, each of these getting rendered from perhaps a different action in our home controller, but we'll have, again, a single folder here for each of those controller actions. Okay, so I'm going to just minimize views for now, and then we'll take a look in models. And so we'll expand this out, and you can kind of structure your view models however you like. But the idea with our view models here is that they are in general just POCO classes, or plain old C# classes. And so let's take a look at our application user class, for instance. Actually, this one is empty by default now, but maybe we look at, we look through here. Yeah, so for our index view model, where we define various different properties that we'll have on each of these models and their types. With this sort of auto property syntax here. And so we'll basically define the types of data that we'd like to display actually in the view, so the way that the user is seeing it and the way that we want to represent it on the front end. So in other words, this will be where we store our view models. Now we'll have a completely separate set of models called our entity models, and we'll actually define those in our data layer. And those will be the C# objects that actually map to our database data. So for instance, we'll have tables in the database that represent our entity models, and then columns on that table will represent the various properties on those models. And so for that, let's go ahead and we'll minimize this directory of models, which is again our view models, and then we'll expand the data directory here. And this will be actually where I'd like to place all of the models that represent the various entities in our system. And in fact, I like to, in general, move all of that completely out of the web project and keep it managed in a separate class library. So let's go ahead and do that now. So if we right click on solution, I'm going to just select add. Oops, and this is good to know. First, we need to actually stop the server. And now we should be able to right click on the solution and add a new project. And we'll select .NET Core. And we're going to create a new .NET Core class library. And so we'll call this lambda forums.data. And we'll say OK. And so this is a class library. It's just going to contain a bunch of different C# files, basically. And now what I'm going to do is actually move some of the files from our actual data folder here that's currently in our web project into the data class library. And in fact, I'm just going to move this application DB context. So if you click and drag application DB context down into our lambda forms.data project, and then we can right click on it in our web project and delete it. And just say OK to confirm. I'll actually do the same thing with the entire data folder, including the migrations folder. And we'll talk about migrations here in just a moment. So we're going to go ahead and delete this.